Hey,
Hey,
what's up?
I'm signing a whole bunch of things. I'm almost done. Well, I'm not
Almost
almost
done?
done. I'm 50% done.
The,
Right.
these are the pages for
Wind and Truth.
Wind and Truth.
Wind and Truth. 15,000 of them. 5,000 for Barnes and Noble, I think, and 10,000 for Dragonsteel Nexus, and
Okay.
for people who order direct from us.
Now this is an embarrassing question for your VP of Narrative to be asking.
Yeah.
Is it Knights of Wind and Truth, or is it just straight Wind and Truth?
Good question. It's not actually embarrassing because it was Knights of Wind and Truth for a while.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No, I was going to ask if
Yeah.
that's something we can ask.
Yeah, you can ask. So, when I originally outlined the Stormlight Archive, I had this idea for making all of the names of the books together be symmetrical.
Yeah.
Right? Like the letters, the abbreviations. It was a kind of dumb idea, right? Because it put too many constraints on when I sat down to name the books, I didn't follow that.
Mm-hmm.
But as I finished Rhythm of War, I realized I'd done it accidentally because I'd already kind of set it up that way. I just changed a few of the titles, and then I changed them to something else, and then it ended up that it was almost there because you've got The Way of Kings, but then you've got Words of Radiance,
Which is
WOR, and then you have Oathbringer, which is no, and then you have Rhythm of War, ROW.
yeah.
And so if I came up with an acronym that was the inverse of The Way of Kings, of, KOWT,
KOWT.
then I would have a full-on symmetrical thing, which is like a thing in the Stormlight Archive.
Yeah.
And so I spent forever trying to come up with one that I liked, and they all felt wrong. The closest I got was Knights of Wind and Truth.
Mm-hmm.
But that just wasn't as strong a title as I wanted it to be. It just didn't feel right to me. And Wind and Truth felt very right to me. For various reasons, it'll make sense when you read the book. So the in-world book is Knights of Wind and Truth. Because every book's named after an in-world book. The title of the book is Wind and Truth. I just like that better. It just sounds better to my ears. It's an art, it's not a science. So instead of calling it Knights of Wind and Truth, but it was named that for a while, which is why you're remembering that. And the in-world book is named that. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's cool. So it's just pure Wind and Truth, which I think is a fantastic name.
It works really well, particularly in context of the story. So, but that's actually, did you do this on purpose? That's related a little bit to our topic.
I didn't do this on purpose. Yeah. I'm just amazing.
You're just amazing because we are going to, you pitched this idea, which is brilliant, which is things that kick you out of stories. Like the things we have to dance around as authors and the things in movies that kick us out, because I felt like if I worked too hard to match that, it would be forced and would kind of undermine the art, which is one of those things that kicks people out, right? Like, when you stretch too hard, when you work too hard to do some goofy idea that you have as an author.
Yeah. When you're trying too hard for a joke and you've stretched so far that it doesn't feel natural anymore.
Yep.
Things like that.
Our good friend Mary Robinette hides Doctor Who in every book.
Yeah.
Which is fun because she makes it very difficult to tell that it's Doctor Who, right? That just like, as a little nod.
Yeah. And they're so subtle that I don't know where half of them are.
It would never be, a trademark problem because it's just she mentions a character in her head, that's Doctor Who. If she tried too hard, then it would kick you out of the book.
Yeah.
Just boot you right out if you saw, a police box in the 1800s in her, Regency fantasy or something like that.
Yeah. Or even just like the Stan Lee cameos.
Yeah.
I think the Stan Lee cameos for the most part work.
Yeah.
In part because Stan Lee himself was such a lovable part of the community and the fandom. But they are always reminders
that you're watching
a movie and that you're watching an MCU movie. I remember his cameo in Guardians of the Galaxy, for example, did kind of kick me out because it's in the middle of a really good scene where we get to see all the characters for the first time and how they really don't like each other and they're fighting with each other. And drawn into this story, all of a sudden I was confronted with Stan Lee again and I was like, oh yeah, that's right. They had to put him somewhere.
Yep. Yeah, that is a bit of an issue. Those films are goofy enough, and you can almost, I know fans have done this, pretend that that's diegetic because our universe exists in the Marvel universe,
Yeah.
and Stan Lee himself exists, and so there's going to be people who look like Stan Lee because of the way the multiverse works, right?
Absolutely makes sense.
And some of them could be Stan Lee from our universe, having gotten pulled into that. So it's possible, but it still is like, oh, it's Stan Lee. Do you have that with other actors when you're like, oh, hey, Sean Bean showed up? That you're reminded, oh, wait, right? Like,
boy. There are definitely character actors that I'm one of those who just loves recognizing actors. I remember that was one of the great tweets when Knives Out first came out. Somebody on Twitter said, Knives Out is your dad's favorite movie because there's so many actors to recognize. And I've never felt more seen by a tweet, because that's what I will do through a whole movie is say, wait, I know that guy from somewhere. And it turns out the waiter was actually also in this other movie and did these other shows. I don't think there's anyone in particular who will pull me out of it, aside from my own tendency to be looking up on IMDb the whole time I'm watching.
yeah.
Which is my fault, not theirs.
Once in a while, there's one where I'm like, it's weird because it doesn't happen to me when I watch like a Ryan Reynolds movie. Because I'm like, oh, Ryan Reynolds is now in this wacky situation, and I accept him as a fictional character who gets pulled into these stories because he acts a similar character in many of his things. Like, Ryan Reynolds has been pulled into this now. It doesn't kick me out because I've signed up for a Ryan Reynolds movie.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But once in a while, when you get a famous actor in a small role.
Yeah, the big cameos like that. I thought, for example, Channing Tatum in Bullet Train was very funny, but it was one cameo too many for me. He was the one that made me feel like, oh, this isn't really a movie. It's just a bunch of actors who like each other having a party. I mean, it's a great movie, and I don't want to bash it. But
right.
Did you ever see Bullet Train?
I haven't seen Bullet Train.
It's worth watching.
Okay.
It's fun.
So yeah, that'll do it to me once in a while. You mentioned before the podcast that the 555 thing kicks you out.
Yeah. So this is something I don't know if this is something that the communications, the FDIC or whatever has done on purpose, but there are no phone numbers in the United States that start with 555. And so that's one that shows up in movies and TV all the time.
Right.
Because if they say a phone number in Law and Order and it's a real phone number, they are accidentally outing some poor
someone's going to call that
plumber
number
from Missouri.
Yeah.
And then everyone's going to call his number. And sometimes shows will do this on purpose. Super Mario Brothers did this, where there was a real phone number you could actually call, and then you'd get like a recorded message. But most of the time, it's a 555 number.
Particularly in television shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I always think, oh, why did they do that? It's just a blaring reminder of this isn't real. This is fake.
I don't have this problem a ton. Even with the actors thing I mentioned, because I think I'm too aware of the construct.
Okay.
As a storyteller myself, I'm not a good judge of this because I don't watch a film without asking, oh, what is the filmmaker doing here? Oh, that was an interesting shot. Oh, this is an interesting narrative choice. That's how I enjoy cinema.
Yeah.
That's how I enjoy books. A piece of my brain, and this happens to a lot of creators. It happened in my 20s where I stopped enjoying books in the same way, and I had to recapture love of books in a different way because I was so analytical with them. And I've talked about this before. The big difference is I can't enjoy things that aren't doing it well anymore. When I was young, I could just read a book and be like, that wasn't very good, but it still was a ride. And I was on the ride and I went on the ride. Now, if I'm not enjoying the ride, if it's not giving me that side where I'm impressed by what they're doing, then I can't enjoy the other side either.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I get that, and that happens to me most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that what I'm reading is really wonderful if it pulls me away from that.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons I rave so much about the Greenbone saga. Reading
Mm-hmm.
Jade City, I was several chapters in and realized I had not been looking at the framework behind it.
Mm-hmm.
I had been enjoying the home for what it was without analyzing the architecture.
Yeah.
And when a story can do that to me, I'm always just delighted by it. Because most of the time, like you say, I'm just looking at the craftsmanship rather than the story that's happening.
So are there things you've done in your books that people have told you kick them out, that you avoid? Or I can start us off on one of these while you think about this. One of the big things you have to deal with writing epic fantasy is the question of diction. And I think we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. What words do you choose? The famous example is, can you call something an ottoman if the Ottoman Empire didn't exist in your fantasy world?
Yeah.
Do you have to call it a footstool? And if you call it an ottoman, will it kick people out? And that's an interesting conversation that people have. I mean, I have my thoughts on it that I've had for many years and kind of are the canon for my books. But have you ever thought about that?
I remember you and I having a conversation about this as long ago as college.
Yeah.
And not coming up with, but mentioning the idea that all of these books have been translated into English or whatever language you're reading in on Earth from their original Elvish or Rosharan or whatever it is. And that's been canon in my head ever since.
That was what Tolkien said, which is where we got it. And it's just such an elegant answer. It's like, otherwise you have to answer, Hoyd makes puns. So he makes a pun about such and such thing. The one that came to mind isn't appropriate for the podcast, perhaps, but he makes a pun. He says this thing, and then you have to ask, well, does that mean the two words that he's punning on are the same in Alethi that they are in English, that he can pun on them? And the answer is no. Wit made an insulting pun. Mm-hmm. And a translator, Brandon Sanderson, brought it to English for you and found something that matches in our language, which is actually what they do when they translate my books into like Chinese and things like that.
And that's one of the things that I deal with a lot. I am, to this day more popular in South America than I am in North America.
Yeah.
And so the Spanish translations of my books, they have to do this. The German ones, the German translation of Blacker Darkness, it's the only country where it's traditionally published. And they did a phenomenal job. That is in a book entirely based on wordplay and puns and language jokes. And they had to change all of them, but they did a really good job with it.
But this, in some ways, gives you just a blank check. You can do whatever you want because you've got this fallback. Mm-hmm. But if it consistently kicks people out, even if you have this explanation, it doesn't help when the person is reading and they get kicked out, right? And the one I've had the most trouble with was when I used the term hat trick in Mistborn. I really liked because, one character, mild spoilers for Mistborn, has killed another character's father, fiance, and brother. And someone says, wow, that's a homicidal hat trick. Such a good line that I kept it, and I looked it up. I'm like, a hat trick is a card game thing. Mm-hmm. It goes back to the 1800s in our world. Like, yeah, I got picked up by some sports teams and things, but it's fine. And I have gotten more comments on that choice than any other joke I've made in books because it is kicked out more people than I think anything I did in those early books.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. And it's right in line with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Of, even if we have a good explanation for it, it pulled someone out of the story.
And not just someone,
pulled lots of people.
Enough people that, and so at that point, what do? Do you cut it? Do you leave it? Do you just say, oh, well?
Boy, I don't know.
Yeah.
I I almost think, and this would not solve the problem,
Mm-hmm.
but like, there's been a couple of times when I've thought, for this fantasy thing, I want to put a disclaimer at the beginning that says this book was originally written in blah blah. Like the
Mm-hmm.
William Goldman thing with
Yeah.
Princess Bride. Here, the original version existed in this form. You're
Mm-hmm.
not reading that. You're reading this translation of it, and it's been abridged in these ways and edited in these other ways. I think that would be fun to put in an epic fantasy,
It would
and I
be.
wonder if it would help with that.
I mean, if we ever write Abraham Lincoln's fanfic of Moby Dick, because it will have to be discovered by a third party.
Yeah.
We've already talked about that.
Well,
A
that's
historian who uncovered
Cecil,
it.
right?
Yeah, Cecil. And Cecil's going to have to be annotating it. And so, I mean, it would be very like Abraham Lincoln to invent a completely new language to write it in.
Oh, yeah. He did
Yeah.
that all the time.
Yeah.
He was big in the conlang community.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of people know this about President.
About him. One of the things that I like a lot with the Stormlight Archive is how you've handled food. Because there is a small but very vocal subset of readers online who will complain far and wide when a fantasy book includes traditionally quote-unquote exotic foods.
Right.
Things that were common, for example, in French, English, Western European cuisine, but only because they traveled all the way over to the Middle
Right.
East to get those particular spices.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll put them in your book, and then someone will say, hey, this implies that there's a Middle East in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or potatoes, which are a New World food, and then you've got potato stew in your very European fantasy, and someone will say, oh, so how did they get their potatoes? Is there South America here? And I, first of all, don't think that's a fair criticism for the
No.
most part. There's something to be said for eliding the realities of, international trade and colonial practices. But on the other hand, no, there's not a South America. There's not a Europe either. These are just the foods that grow here.
Exactly.
And you've done that in Roshar by not falling back on tropes. They eat very specifically Rosharan foods that feel natural for the environment where they live.
But that's a danger because it adds to the brain load that you have to read a book, right? Like there is nothing wrong with doing it the other way and be like they're eating. In most of the books you'll read, even in the Cosmere, they'll eat potato stew, right? Once in a while, I'll do something like Roshar, but it adds such a brain load. It adds such a to the reader. It's just so much harder to get into and even in Roshar, we call them miles and feet.
Yeah.
They would not have those, the foot maybe, but probably not even that, right?
Yeah. How do you handle hours and minutes and seconds?
We call them hours and minutes and seconds,
Yeah.
but they have a 20-hour day.
Mhm.
And even that is super hard, right? Because, and the Rosharan week is a different length.
Yeah.
And we play with it, but it can trip people up if you're not very careful with it. Like Roshar, the year comes out, people are about 10% older. It's the only planet I've really done this on because when I say that someone's 17 and they're actually 19, that's a big difference,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
It's tricky. And hours and days and months and how many weeks it was. Well, if I say it's this many weeks, it's actually less than you think it is because
Yeah.
So it adds to that brain load and the average reader. Like if you didn't call them feet, you called them, zincs.
Zincs.
Yeah. Zips or zaps or, you came up with a thing that just adds that much more brain load. And yes, a reader is smart enough to be like, all right, that's a unit of measurement. And an author is smart enough to give you context that that's a long distance or a short distance. But the more of those you add, the harder it is to read. And so what I say is like, look, the translator is leaving a lot of these things to give you the right feel. But when a time is mentioned, they're often changing it to a time that you understand.
Yeah.
And things like that, or approximating it so that, yeah.
There's a balance to how you immerse yourself into something. Because on the one hand, yes, the fact that they eat crab curry and roshar helps with the immersion,
Yep.
right? And the fact that they have all these very different plants and things. On the other hand, if you did that with every single aspect of their culture,
Yep.
it would not be immersive. It would be like trying to sink into a tub of needles or cactus spines or something, because there are just so many things that you have to keep in mind, that you have to remember.
I mean, it's hard to write too. I've gotten better at it with Roshar. You read the first draft or the first printing of Way of Kings and compare it to Words of Radiance. I had learned by then to use better Roshar and metaphors. But when I was writing the first one, like I use bird metaphors, ravens, like a raven, dark as a raven in that book. Well, no Rosharan would use that, even though,
they would say dark as a chicken.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't even say dark as a chicken. They haven't seen a raven, right?
Yeah.
They would say something else. I did a fine job in Original Way of Kings, but not a perfect one, to the point that we've changed a few of them now that I'm better at it. Because I think if you know Roshar, that will kick you out. Like, why is Dalinar comparing something to a raven? He's probably never seen a raven. So,
one of the ways that food pulls me out of television shows, for example, is the Chinese takeout containers. Because, and you will see this all the time, if you know to look for it, if somebody is eating food in a movie or in TV, there's a pretty good chance they're eating with chopsticks and Chinese takeout containers. And the reason is that you can't see the food.
Yep.
And so the
they can do a lot of
continuity
takes.
is so much easier because they don't have to keep track of how much food was there in the last shot. And then when we edit it, now suddenly there's a different amount of food on the plate. In fact, I was watching Rush Hour the other day, and there's a bit where Chris Tucker is very obviously eating nothing out of a fake container and just lifts it up high enough that you can't see him put food in his mouth. It's just so easy. It makes filming food scenes and eating scenes so much easier that they do it all the time. To the point that when I see people eating Chinese food in a movie or a TV show, it immediately reminds me, oh, that's why they're doing this.
How many people did you just ruin movies for?
I hope everyone.
At least one.
You never get to enjoy movies again. And on the one hand, yay, I'm glad they're eating Chinese food. I love Chinese food. But on the other hand, that's not why they're eating Chinese food.
Can't see the food. Have you ever gotten complaints now? Coming back to it from readers.
Yeah, coming back to this.
That certain things kick them out.
Word choice is one. Authors have a tendency to really love a certain word.
Oh, yeah, we should talk about that.
To fall into the pattern of it. And then for 4 chapters in a row, I'll overuse one word.
Yeah, every author does this.
Yeah. And if I don't catch it and the editor doesn't catch it and it makes it to print, which happens all the time, then I will often hear about it. And someone will say, why are you using this particular adjective for so many things? And it's just because it got stuck in my head.
Yeah,
it was an earworm.
There's something a word you use that you don't realize other people don't use as often. And then you use it, and this was maladroitly for me. Too many uses of maladroitly in the early Mistborn books. And I'm not even sure why. Probably because there's an author I read who used maladroitly a lot. And so therefore, maladroit became a common thing in my phraseology when I was writing, but it's not a commonly used word in real life. And so it kicks people out.
Yeah. What does maladroitly mean?
Oh, to be adroit is to be competent at something. And maladroitly means you do it undexterously or incompetently.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
that's the problem, is that there's so many words. The more you read and the more you learn, the wider your vocabulary is. You realize that there are some words that fit a particular emotion or action or state so perfectly that you want to use it, even though nobody else really does.
Yeah.
In common conversation.
Another thing linguistically. So if you're a language nerd, you may start doing things with your writing that feel unnatural but are natural. And they can kick you out too. This like I bet dialect when you hit it kicks most people out. When you hit the wee free men speaking in straight up Scottish brogue, and you have to stop and try to decipher it, kicks you out. But it's also funny because it's Pratchett. He knows that he is kicking you out.
How to use it, yeah.
But in Elantris, the German or Spanish do this thing. Korean does this thing where there's a phrase you will add to the end of a sentence to say, do you understand? Kudicho? Like, isn't that so? Is kind of what it means. And people use it quite a lot. In English, we use certain contextual clues in our language to say, it's your turn to speak now. It's your turn to agree or disagree with me. And you'll just see people doing this, but we don't have the one word. We have a bunch of words that do this.
Yeah.
But in a lot of languages, there's just a single word, and it's as invisible as the to them. You add it into your sentence to basically be like, now you get to speak. Now you agree. It's time to agree with me, or I need some reinforcement here. It's almost more of a symbol than it is words. And I thought that was really cool and a little bit different from English. Even though we do it, we don't have one.
Yeah, we do it slightly differently.
Yeah. And so when I wrote Elantris, I put that into to Galadan's language. The Dula language has Kolo, right? And he would put it at the end of like a lot of sentences because you will hear these things quite frequently. And I even used it a lot less. And my editor, Moshe, was just driven crazy by it because it was too much for him. He's like, this is going to kick everyone out. And he made me cut another half of them. He was probably right.
Yeah.
To do so, because even still, people reading like, that's a lot of colos. But I don't get that comment that often.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that, like you said, it's invisible to us when we're doing it. There's so many ways that we talk. Even the word like that I just used. That is one of the English ways to say, I am thinking, give me a second. In Spanish, that is como. And if I was saying como this, and if it's invisible to you if it's your own language, and then very, very noticeable if you try to see it in another language. And so that's interesting to put that into fiction and see if you can get your audience, over time to stop noticing it.
Yeah.
But dangerous up until they do. One of the things that they do in movies all the time that bothers me and that reminds me I'm watching a movie is nobody says goodbye on the telephone.
Yep. I think you've mentioned this one before.
Yeah.
They just hang up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep. That one, I don't notice it as much as you do, but then again, I am always aware I'm watching a film.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop for me.
Yeah, and it's because we don't need to add those extra things, like the process of, okay, thanks, I'll talk to you later, bye.
Do umlauts or accents on names in fantasy books kick you out?
I love them.
Mm-hmm.
I love diacritical marks, and I love to read them. Actually, the new series that you and I are working on together, I was doing some world building on that just last week. And was trying to do some of this work while I was up at the young men's camp that I was doing. And I wanted to add some diacriticals to that. And I might end up cutting that from the language and from the naming conventions purely because the keyboard that I use can't easily produce them. It can make them, but it's like 3 extra keystrokes per letter every time that letter comes up, and it will slow me down so much.
I really wish this hadn't become a meme, that diacritical marks and these things weren't, like, if you don't know, early, like if you were part of the fantasy science fiction community in the 90s or in early 2000s, people made fun of all of these a lot.
Yeah, apostrophes in particular.
Apostrophes in particular, and to the point that there's a famous essay that says you should read them all as boing. And this always sat wrong with me, right? Because where did this come from? This came from Tolkien doing legitimate research into the naming. What are they making fun of? They're making fun of people who are copying Tolkien and not knowing as much as he does about the linguistics and adding them in because they look cool, right? It's the same way you make fun of the umlauts in a metal band.
Yeah.
But what it turned into is gatekeeping. People who wanted to build a culture that these marks are normal in, that this is the baseline, were getting made fun of.
Yeah.
Because,
Well, and not just gatekeeping, but it's a very kind of Western-centric, English, Anglo-centric
that's kind of what I meant.
View of language, right? If you say, oh, all these diacritical marks, you're just trying to act fancy. No, I'm not. I'm trying to act Hungarian.
Yes.
And, I've been to Hungary. I've done tons of book events there. They friggin' love it when authors do this kind of stuff. When their names and their sounds show up in Western fiction, it delights them. At least the fans that I've talked to. I shouldn't paint the entire culture with one brush, right?
Right.
But yeah, because it reads as very different to us, and because there are, the Motley Crue style misuses of diacriticals.
I even love Motley Crue. I love that metal has its own use. That's a legitimate use now. The language has shifted. Maybe it was wrong when they did it, but now you can use an umlaut like that.
Yes.
And it means something. It doesn't mean what it means in some of the languages that they were borrowing for when they came up with this, but it means something in the metal naming convention.
In the metal subculture.
Yep.
And it works. And so, if you're just putting them in there, and, the apostrophe is an egregious example because it is very easy to use.
Yes.
Every keyboard has an apostrophe. It's easy to stick it into a name. It makes it look different and new and unique.
But why wouldn't a new fantasy world have something that uses an apostrophe?
Yeah.
I think that would be very common. And
using apostrophes, using accent marks, using hot checks, using all these other things that make language look and sound really beautiful. It's hard to do them in, partly because of the keyboard issue, and partly because of, people will just go, oh, look at this guy trying to be all fancy with his words. So...
Speaking of people who are fancy, how's that been?